It's a pleasure to be with you all today. And it's really a pleasure and a privilege to be speaking with Dr. Ishaan on a topic that is at the very center of our collective challenge of sustainability. And that's the interface between government and the world of policy, and of course, the private sector. And just before I introduce Ishaan to you, and before we dive into our discussion, I'd like just to offer some framing content that I think is important to set the stage, if you will. If you could please bring up the slides. Many people on this call, no doubt, are practitioners in government, policymakers. I've had the privilege to serve for 5 years in government myself, but many of you are not. And I think what's crucial to understand in the context of climate change about government, next slide, please, is the central role of uncertainty. And you see here, next slide, please. You see here an image of Douglas North receiving his Nobel Prize from the King of Sweden. More than anybody else, Douglas North made clear the ways in which human beings and human societies form institutions, including public institutions, to some extent centrally for the purpose of reducing and managing uncertainty. That's what institutions are. They are arrangements, predictable arrangements that reduce uncertainty, and another set of arrangements that help to manage it. And of course, in the context of the current moment, given the incredibly disruptive period we've entered, really a critical juncture in history, which means a period in history when a tremendous amount of structural change is happening in an exceptionally short period, the challenge of uncertainty for all institutions, including government, is arguably unprecedented. And so what we see in this context is that many leading governments are embracing that change and making tremendous progress, but many other governments are not. They're not adapting quickly enough. And really, that frontier between the legacy approaches that are no longer working and the new approaches that are emerging is what we want to explore today. Next slide, please. So from a recent study that we did, we've looked in depth at what are the characteristics of the government of the future that will be most effective. And there are many. I'm only going to touch on two in the context of this conversation. First, just overarchingly, is that they will increasingly be systematically public value driven, meaning they will be laser clear about what does it mean to create public value and what is their role in doing so. And a whole host of countries are becoming increasingly sophisticated in doing that, including by being enabled by data-driven and evidence-based policy, by being ever more laser focused on citizen and human centricity, as we call it, which is not just a catchphrase, but it means engineering government in ways that are very tailored to individual citizens. Another, of course, crucial element is being trustworthy and transparent. From COVID, the most robust empirical finding with respect to how countries fared through the crisis is that countries with high trust in their governments did best. And so there are a whole host of ways, including through technology, by which governments are innovating to be more trustworthy. But in the context of this conversation, it is the attribute of being what we call market harnessing that most distinguishes the frontier of innovation. And that refers to taking proactive approaches to leveraging private sector competition to create public goods. Now, these attributes, which are happening all over the world, are driven by many things, but they are nowhere are they more necessary than with respect to the challenge of climate change. Next slide, please. And the reason is that climate change, the challenge of sustainability, touches everything that governments do. It touches international policy, of course, and international policy touches it. That is, governments are increasingly engaged in processes and constrained by processes and agreements to achieve consensus on difficult policy choices for which they then have to have political support at home. The fundamental challenge of growth and competitiveness, which is really at the center of what we'll discuss today, is of course a crucial aspect of this challenge. It's also increasingly significant with respect to national security and resilience. As we see the increasing frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, it's clear that to deal with those, governments now increasingly categorize climate change as a national security challenge. And then all of these things taken together, for those who serve in government, have to manage the fiscal position, fiscal policy. And of course, we're already witnessing unprecedented debt. So there are new fiscal constraints on what government can do. And in that context, taking on this historic challenge becomes particularly difficult, and it really demands innovation. Next slide, please. The central challenge in this for government, and for those who've served, and for those who perhaps on this call who have served in government as politicians, know this all too painfully well. The core challenge is managing this tension between economic competitiveness and sustainability, and the constituencies on both sides of that equation. And that manifests itself in multiple lines of tension. One pertains straightforwardly to the competitiveness of traded products. Another relates to the cost of transitioning to sort of new value chain structures, in particular with respect to the circular economy, as we'll discuss in a moment. And then fundamentally and even intergenerationally, to the sort of balancing of near-term and longer-term returns and what those mean for investors. So policymakers, politicians find themselves having to manage this tension to be, and many, by the way, have failed because of an inability to manage it. Some are just managing it, but there are other countries in which we are seeing the transformation of these challenges. Next slide, please. And so in the context of that, the EU is actually a remarkable example. So what we see in the case of the European Union is having not only led in terms of its commitments over time, it has undertaken, as I know most of the people on this call are very familiar, the cross-border adjustment mechanism, by which it is effectively changing the game, both internally and externally, with respect to sustainability. So by using trade policies and its huge market size, then for its members and its trade partners, it's forging a new environment where climate forwardness is actually an advantage and no longer for its leading companies a cost disadvantage. Next slide, please. The Dutch, of course, are also remarkable innovators in this space. So having made huge and strikingly ambitious commitments, including with respect to the circular economy, they found in the Netherlands that the private sector was struggling to adapt effectively. And so they innovated. This is the core of what we want to really discuss today. Through a program they called the Green Deals Program, not to be confused with the European Green Deal. These are green deals that are specific partnership arrangements with private sector players by which they first understand the barriers to their participating in the circular economy and then work together to reduce those, to make it possible for them. And the results have been remarkable. They're building trust, they're building confidence, and they're turning this circular economy objective into a source of competitive advantage and opportunity for their private sector. Next slide, please. Singapore, of course, is a leader in countless domains of governance. They're easily one of the most respected and effective governments in the world. And some would argue, of course, they're small, granted, but they also have a legacy. First of all, the strategic foresight of anticipatory governance, but also sustainability and also data. So in this case, they were producing, they realized, tremendously valuable untapped data resources. And so they undertook to create a collaborative data platform to make that information specifically with respect to sustainability more available to stakeholders across the ecosystem. In effect, they made the reality of climate change and the reality of the impact of policies that support it, or interventions or industrial or value chains that support sustainability more visible, as well as the cost of not doing so. And so in a way, by having a reality-oriented data platform, they allowed the market to more efficiently allocate resources, to price the cost of climate change, and to reward the benefits of taking action against them. Next slide, please. So if we look across these examples, and this is just a partial subset, we're going to get with Ishaan, we're going to get into a much more interesting range of things, but just to give you a framework within which to put this, we see how powerful government can play a role as a market calibrator to sort of ensure that there are not distortions in the market that disadvantage their private sector entities that in ways that are unsustainable for them politically. We're also seeing government as an orchestrator, as the Dutch represented, orchestrating stakeholders, solving problems to help bridge the gap. And then finally, government as an innovation platform, and really as a data platform, using the public good of data to improve capital allocation. Next slide, please. So all of this, of course, is challenging, and it's fantastic to see the progress that's being made, but it's also really important for us. And this is where, as I turn to you, Ishaan, I think it's just important for this audience and all of us to realize that we're facing a very, very challenging period, as if I had to tell any of us. So first of all, the geopolitical tension and the economic fragmentation that we're seeing, in many ways, we have to expect that it's going to constrain the prospects for the most meaningful forms of global collaboration on climate policy. It's just going to get harder for the great powers to be aligned on those issues. There's just no escaping that fact. And at the same time, we're facing really remarkable macroeconomic challenges, as the IMF now has just confirmed, in terms of both inflation and, unfortunately, the prospect of stagflation. And what does that mean? It means managing the tension between competitiveness and sustainability is ever more important. Finding new ways to make the economics of that interface function are ever more crucial, because we cannot rely on unlimited investable resources, nor on pristine utopian global collaboration. We've got to solve it at the frontier of where it's occurring. And the good news, of course, is that there's also very likely already underway a new wave of breakthroughs in transformative technologies that are creating new opportunities for progress that may change the mathematics, if you will, of the interface. And so in that context, we're really very privileged to have Ishaan with us. Next slide, please. And I just would like to introduce him to you briefly. He's an economist. He focuses on topics of climate change, growth, trade, and development. But the reason we asked him to be here today is just because of the brilliant work he's doing. He's currently a postdoctoral fellow at the International Economics section of Princeton, but his background, his PhD from Chicago at the Climate Impact Lab and the Energy Policy Institute in Chicago, has put him exactly at the place where his formal academic research in economics and seeing how it's applied in policy makes him uniquely qualified for this discussion today. The fact that we share Chicago and Stanford, I must say, might have been an added inducement. I have to disclose my bias. But Ishaan, thank you so much for being with us. And if I may, let me just start right off in an area that I know for which we share a fascination and a passion. And honestly, trade is a domain where all of these things come to bear. In so many ways, these questions are determined by trade, because competitiveness is, of course, internationally denominated. So how do you see global trade and trade policy interfacing with the consequences of climate change?
Great. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me here. This is really exciting. And thanks for that wonderful introduction. It's always really funny for a young academic to hear praise like that, because most of our life consists of submitting papers to journals and having anonymous referees rip us apart. And so it's always fun when someone tells you the great things you're doing and kind of frames it like that. So to your question about trade and trade policy related to climate change, this was actually the subject of my PhD dissertation that I finished a couple of years ago. So we think a lot about trade related to climate change mitigation and reducing emissions. There's a lot of talk about how some countries have regulations to reduce carbon emissions or a price on carbon, and other countries don't. That might create some certain imbalances in some sectors about the way trade policy is treating certain sectors of the economy. But I want to talk about something a little bit different, which is kind of more on the adaptation side to climate change. So the research question that I had in my dissertation was basically, we know that extreme temperatures are bad for crops and moderate temperatures are good. So we can expect global warming to have some really, from other research has suggested, we can expect global warming to have some really extreme impacts on global agriculture in the hottest parts of the world, like really reducing productivity in like South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And so you might ask yourself, or some people have asked themselves in economics, well, maybe we could adapt to climate change by shifting more of our farms to colder parts of the world, like Canada, where agricultural productivity is likely to have neutral or even some positive effects from global warming. So that's kind of the question I tackled in a lot of my PhD. And unfortunately, the finding there was there are some large potential gains from these hotter parts of the world reallocating away from agriculture. If they were able to, we can expect other sectors of the economy to be hit less hard than the agricultural sector, which might be intuitive. Manufacturing, services, they're more indoors, they rely more on people and less on the weather. So there are some large potential gains there, but unfortunately what I found in my dissertation is that these gains are really unlikely to be realized under current levels of tradability in poor countries. And that's basically because there is very close to zero trade in agriculture in the poorest countries in the world. The fact I calculated in my paper is that the average person in the poorest quartile of the world consumes 91% domestically produced food, compared with 45% in the richest quartile. So because these economies are relatively closed, you get actually very little of this trade effect that would naturally sort of start to shift them towards importing more of their food and exporting more of manufactured goods as the climate starts to warm. And instead, what I project in my paper is that as agricultural productivity declines in these places, because they have to produce enough food to meet the demand in their domestic economy. As it gets harder and harder to produce food, my paper actually projects that more of the economy will get stuck in this sector that's really getting crushed by global warming in these hotter parts of the world as the climate heats up. And so that's like really not a great outcome. But then my paper also shows, if we pretended for a second, what if the poorest countries were trading as much as the richest countries are today, which we can think of as like kind of a feasible but maybe very difficult outcome for them to really increase their ability to trade. In that scenario, the costs of climate change are much lower in those economies, because then you see more of the reallocation away from the hardest hit sector. They start to import their food, production and exports move away from agriculture into the other sectors. So a critical implication of that paper I wrote is that more openness to trade, whatever that might mean, and it turns out it's kind of complicated what that might mean, but more openness to trade could really help poor countries adapt to climate change. Now, in terms of what that means, it's actually probably something that goes far beyond tariffs, or what we think of as like the easiest trade policies. The tariffs are not actually close to large enough to explain why there's so little trade. They are higher in poor countries, but they're not large enough to explain why they trade so little. So we think it's more likely these infrastructure barriers, poor road quality, poor port quality, a lot of landlocked countries, really high sort of corruption barriers, bribes that people have to pay, bureaucratic shipping delays, things like that. So we think those actually, kind of surprisingly, could be a really important margin to make progress on climate change adaptation if we could find ways to ship goods more easily in the poorest countries in the world. So that's one reason that I'm kind of passionate about trade and trade policy as a way to help us not only reduce the consequences of climate change, but also adapt to them. You're muted, Rudolph.
I didn't want anybody to hear me breathing. Thank you so much for that. It's a big part of really why I wanted to have you today, because in a way it's a contrarian view. So much of what we hear now is about localization, about fragmentation, about resilience, self-sufficiency being announced by the heads of state of the largest, most powerful economies in the world. And the idea that trade, and whether that's enabled, as you say, through infrastructure or through trade arrangements, but that is actually very robust with respect to the central challenge of our time, is a very, very important finding, and one that's easy to lose sight of. So what does self-sufficiency mean in a context where nobody's going to make it if it gets that bad? We need those investments in infrastructure. We need that trade perspective. So thank you for that. And then the question becomes, how is the trade policy landscape shifting in your view? What do you see happening?
Yeah, it seems kind of unfortunately to me, as someone whose view of this literature is that there's a lot of benefits to trade, and that the benefits are maybe a little bit understated and the costs are somewhat overstated. It seems to me like we're really shifting away from, at least in a lot of developed countries, the consensus that we used to have that even like 10 years ago in the United States, for example, both political parties were roughly in favor of more openness to trade, lower trade barriers, more trade agreements, things like that. And now it seems like both political parties are pretty opposed to those sorts of things. And to me, I think the justifications that have become really prominent in our political discourse are not, I'm not really a big believer in some of these justifications. And so you hear a lot about the manufacturing jobs and kind of the American heartland that have been lost to trade. And I think, we had lots of presidential campaigns on both sides of the aisle that were discussing these. And we do have research that suggests that that was like a really significant impact on certain parts of our country. And so that's not to be overlooked or not to be understated. But I think it's important to put those sorts of manufacturing job losses caused by trade into kind of a broader context of the decline in manufacturing employment globally across the world. It's crazy to me when you look at the data on manufacturing as a share of employment in the United States or in other countries in the OECD, it really contrasts with manufacturing as a share of GDP. And what's fascinating is the manufacturing share of GDP, which is really what you'd expect trade and trade policy to be able to affect the most, is totally flat in the United States. It's like 13, 14% in 1960. You look at the graph, it just stays totally flat over the last 50 years. And that's actually true in a lot of leading OECD economies. And then you look in contrast to the manufacturing share of employment, and it's just a totally uninterrupted downward line. It's like you think about any historical event, you think about the rise of Japan, the rise of China, you think about the broader, you think about NAFTA, you think about other countries entering the WTO, all these things happen, and it's just kind of an uninterrupted downward trend in manufacturing employment. And what's fascinating is that's true in every leading OECD economy. So in Germany, where there's lots more export to manufacturing, still a clear downward trend. Adam Posen at the Peterson Institute has some really great articles summarizing this that people can read if they're interested. So what that tells me is that the manufacturing share of employment is going down over time, but the share of GDP is staying constant. So all that's really happening is we need many fewer workers to make the same stuff in places like the United States. And that's kind of the really dominant trend that I think it is really hollowing out this heartland and causing this decline in manufacturing jobs. And so when you think about that, you have this long-term trend. And then in addition to that, you have all sorts of sources of volatility besides trade. So a crazy fact that I calculated in one of my papers with some senior co-authors is that for manufacturing jobs in the United States, 38% of all manufacturing jobs no longer exist 5 years later. And that's kind of a long run average over the last 4 decades. So that's taking the proportion of jobs at firms that shrunk. So you add up the jobs that are missing from the firms that shrunk, and you add up the jobs from the firms that exited over a 5-year period. And you just take those and you divide that by the average of total jobs over the beginning and end of the 5-year period. And that's 38% of all jobs. And so when you think about that, there's this constant that we think is good, that's probably contributing to economic growth in a lot of ways, that some firms are innovating and displacing other firms. So there's a lot of benefits to that. But that creative destruction is creating all sorts of volatility. Plants are closing, workers are losing their jobs. And that's kind of a baseline rate that's happening in ways that are mostly unrelated to trade. Could be that trade is speeding up that creative destruction a little bit. You're experiencing innovations from foreign firms, and that could be speeding that up. But in general, when we think about these jobs that manufacturing workers in Ohio or Pennsylvania lost to trade, it's in the context of manufacturing jobs being lost to a lot of other reasons. So I don't really think that's a great, and then I have this whole kind of other ramble I'm not sure if I should go into, but politicians talk a lot about the trade deficit and how the United States has this big trade deficit and maybe we should be reducing trade because of that. And I think that's actually like a really confused understanding of why we have a trade deficit. The reason why we have a trade deficit is related to macroeconomic forces of the imbalance between savings and investment in the United States. There's a lot more investment in the United States than there is savings. And that's partially because the dollar is the world's global reserve currency, and people really want our dollars without needing our goods because they're the unit of account for all these international transactions, oil markets. Oil traded between Saudi Arabia and India is the trade happens in dollars. People need dollars all around the world. Central banks want dollars as their reserves. And that creates this demand for US dollars that kind of pushes up the value of our currency relative to what it would be without that reserve currency force. And that makes it harder for our exporters to export. And that's really what's driving the trade deficit. We could have all the tariffs in the world and it wouldn't make an inch of a dent on the trade deficit. So I think there's a lot of political rhetoric that's kind of divorced from the economics of this issue.
Yeah, and it's totally distorting then our approach to climate change, where we see then that trade could be beneficial to our sort of global resilience. We're over-indexing to false assumptions about what trade is and job creation. So I thank you for that. And just going deeply into decarbonization, so many countries, and it's great to see, have announced these very ambitious plans to decarbonize. How do you see those playing out over the coming decades?
Yeah, well, I think this ties in together with the previous discussion too. I think my concern about these decarbonization plans is first of all, are they really credible commitments? We have these governments that change every few years when there's a new election in the United States. The political party that supports more climate policy is in danger of kind of getting clobbered in the fall midterms this year. They're not looking so great for the 2024 presidential election. So that's one issue, is are these commitments credible? And then the second issue is, are we assembling this decarbonization way, these decarbonization policies in such a way that really laser focused on minimizing the costs of decarbonization? And I'm pretty concerned about that, but especially in the United States, where a lot of our policies are sort of subsidizing these existing mature technologies rather than allowing for the flexibility for the market to kind of innovate and figure out what the lowest cost way is. And this actually ties back into the trade discussion too. In the Biden administration's Build Back Better plan and in a lot of their climate policies, there are these domestic sourcing requirements. If we need to build X% of the solar panels at home and things like that, and that might be good if your view is sort of this kind of mercantilist view of trade, where we need to produce as much as possible and buy as little as possible, and build up some sort of surplus of gold or something like it's 1555. But if your view is that what we want to do is decarbonize in the cheapest way possible, then you might want the Chinese solar panels if those are the cheapest technology available. So I think that's kind of my broad level concern about these decarbonization plans. And then more specifically, I'm personally not really a technology expert, but it really worries me as kind of an outsider to this, as kind of a witness, the rhetoric that's getting used about how we have all the technology available, the technology is totally ready. We have wind and solar have gotten way cheaper over the last few decades, and that's extremely good. That's terrific for energy markets. We still don't know how to store that electricity, and we still don't know how to make it available at the times of day and the times of year when people are using it, because when it's sunny is not always when people are using their electricity. We still don't have any commercially used batteries. To my knowledge, there's no grid scale commercially used batteries anywhere in the world. And so I think this kind of issue of how we're balancing supply and demand on the grid in the presence of these intermittent sources continues to be like a really big problem in energy markets. And people have known that historically, but for some reason the rhetoric in a lot of the decarbonization policy that I see, especially in the United States, has kind of shifted away from knowing that that's a problem and towards kind of overlooking it as a problem, which sort of concerns me. In contrast, in the European Union, I think their climate policy is coming a lot more from what we would think of as the economics textbook. They have this global cap and trade system for the entire European Union. They just made the target a lot more aggressive. I think the target is now a 55% reduction from some baseline. I think it might be the 2005 baseline by 2030. And basically that allows for the flexibility for firms to choose how the firms, utilities, whoever it is in the private sector, to choose the lowest cost methods to reduce emissions. And it forces that reduction in emissions. When you just subsidize the technology, people can use it, people can not use it. But when you require that emissions are going to come down, you have these tradable permits, and you're sort of guaranteeing a better climate outcome, and you're getting a better outcome on kind of this balance that's the subject of today's discussion, this balance between economic stability or economic competitiveness, or what we want to call it, and sustainability. So I think in many ways, I feel really jealous of what's going on. You shouldn't be jealous because it's a global public good that they're contributing to, but I think it's great that we have this one continent that's sort of following policy straight from the textbook, whereas in the United States, we seem to be sort of throwing things up against the wall and hoping something sticks, and that makes me really nervous.
Yeah, it's amazing to think that in many ways, Sweden respects market forces and economics more than some of the previously extremely capitalistic countries of the world. Thank you so much for that. Let's switch this topic about adaptation. So much focuses on preventing. But what do you see as sort of the policies and the technologies that are more focused on adaptation to the effects of climate change?
Yeah, so I think this is a really critical thing to talk about. The thing I know best is sort of economics academia. And in economics academia, we have sort of 35 years of hundreds and thousands of papers that are like, what is the optimal way to reduce carbon emissions? How exactly should we structure a carbon tax, things like that. And we have like 5-10 years of papers that are just barely starting to kind of peek out from under the covers and think about, oh, well, we're going to have some amount of climate change in the best case scenario if we stopped emitting tomorrow, and we're likely not going to stop emitting tomorrow. It's actually crazy. If you look at a historical graph of global emissions, it's just up and up and up and up. It's kind of like that graph of manufacturing employment I was describing, but in the opposite direction. Like, there's a lot of optimism, and I think it's good to have optimism about technology and the forces reducing carbon emissions, but in the data, all we see is more and more and more emissions. So we're, even in the best case scenario, likely to have quite a bit of climate change. And I think it's really important for the conversation to try to think about the consequences of that in really concrete material ways, and how we can think about technology to try to adapt to that. I think in a lot of people's minds, climate change is sort of this vague, like raining balls of hellfire that we don't really know what to do about. But I think now we have the research to think about, here are concrete things we think are changing in the economy, and maybe that can help us think about what to do about them. So there's the agricultural sector that's very hard hit by climate change. We need to think about which sorts of crops and which sorts of places are the most resistant to the types of heat and the types of drought that we might see in the future. We might want to think about how our markets integrated across space so that the crops that are able to grow in a hotter climate are able to get to the people who need to eat them. We can think about all of these coastal impacts. There are the hurricanes, there's the sea level rise. How do we make coastal property and coastal industry and everything that's going on in our coastal cities around the world? How do we make that resistant to storms and to sea level rise? 34% of the world's population lives within some X miles of a coast. I mean, it's 20 miles of a coast or something like that. So a lot of people live on coastlines, and we think those are vulnerable to global warming. So we have all these sorts of technology areas that we think might really benefit from the types of innovations that are focused on what is this hotter world going to look like. But another point I want to make about that quickly is that the incentives to innovate and adaptation are actually a lot better and make me a lot more optimistic than the incentives to innovate in mitigation. So for adaptation investments, it's a firm that's making the investment is the one benefiting from that investment. Whereas for emissions reductions, the firm that's investing to reduce their emissions, the entire world is benefiting in this sort of diffuse, really tiny little way. Like some firm in Louisiana reduces their emissions, and some person in Delhi in 2075 is benefiting from that, from the climate being marginally less hot. And so that's like we call that in economics an externality. The firm that's making the investment is not getting the benefits, so you might expect a really severe underinvestment. Whereas in adaptation, you'll see some of that. The innovations will be captured by other firms, and other people will benefit from the innovations, but the firms that are making the investments in adaptation are likely to benefit themselves in a way that's not true for mitigation. So that makes me somewhat more optimistic.
By the way, just on that one, the country in which I'm sitting, all these things are so incredibly true. So I'm sitting in Dubai. The UAE, 85% of its economic activities in those coastal zones, so vulnerable to climate change. And by the way, paradoxically, the same number, and of course, imports 85% of its food, but is investing tremendously on both fronts, in both making its coastal environments more resilient and in diversifying its food portfolio, including through a whole host of investments in climate-resistant food, as you've mentioned. So that's part of the joy of living in Dubai, is that it's just relentless innovation on exactly those frontiers. So thank you so much for that. And actually, this point you've made about how the incentives of adaptation are so much more appealing, that is a huge opportunity. And for those in the private sector in our audience, I think it resonates a great deal. Let's turn to agriculture and food in a little bit more depth. I mean, what are the impacts of global warming on agriculture? How significant? How do you see those unfolding?
Yeah, so there's a lot of research on this. I'm sort of a consumer of this academic literature, and I use some of those results in my own work. Basically, we think it's really hot. We think it's really hard for crops as it gets hotter and as it gets drier in certain parts of the world. So people have projected that for certain crops, even over the next 20, 30 years, we can expect to see in places like sub-Saharan Africa, like a 20, 30% decline in agricultural productivity relative to what we would see without global warming. So these are like really huge first order effects. But the other thing that's worth noting about that is that unlike some of the other sectors of the economy, it seems like the rich countries are actually not insulated from these sorts of severe weather impacts on crops. So in places like the United States and Europe, we still see effects like for every degree hotter on a really hot day. They call these killing degree days in the agricultural literature. It's like if you take a hot day and make it 1 degree hotter, for every one of those, you get something like a 0.6% reduction. This is off the top of my head, so it might be wrong, but something like a 0.6% reduction in annual yields for crops like corn and soybeans in the US. And so when you think about like dozens of killing degree days being added in these parts of the US Midwest, you think about some of these really heat sensitive crops might not be the ones we want to grow into the future. And so we might want to think about like really large scale changes in which crops farmers are growing in which places. This also interacts with which parts of the world is water getting more and more scarce in and are suffering severe droughts. We might want to think hard about, are the water intensive crops being planted in the water abundant places or the water scarce places? Because there's a finite fixed amount of water in the world. I think people usually think about, oh, the whole world is getting drier. That's not really the case. It's some places are getting drier and some places are getting wetter. So if we're able to reallocate the crops that really need water to the places that have more water, then we might be able to adapt to those sorts of changes as well. And that's actually something that in your part of the world has been a really, there's been a really big push for that. I think some of these countries in the Middle East are starting to, in addition to importing their food, they're like leasing land in other parts of the world where there is more water so they can grow like the rice or whatever that they might need to grow there.
So, I mean, further evidence of your opening point about the contribution to robustness and resilience of trade and not having obstacles to it, and the risk of food nationalism, which in a separate study we've been looking at in some depth, which is really very high. Agriculture also accounts for about a quarter of global emissions, of course, at the same time. What are some of the most effective ways of reducing those?
Yeah, so this is another place where I think the public conversation is frequently pretty divorced from the facts. So people think a lot about, am I eating locally? There's a lot of talk about the transportation aspect of emissions, but that's actually like pretty close to irrelevant in the data. Transportation accounts for like less than 10% and often less than 5% of the emissions associated with a given food. And what's actually much more important is, are you getting first of all, are you getting the food from the place where it's grown most efficiently? Because that actually has a bigger impact on emissions. So this again goes back to the trade point. But then also, second of all, what sorts of food are we eating are really important. The more animal intensive goods, I'm kind of like an animal welfare, almost vegan. So this like matters to me in ways beyond kind of how it matters to the economy, but even how it matters to emissions into the economy, the animal products are really much more important for emissions than kind of, did you get your banana from the local farmer's market or from a foreign country? That actually doesn't turn out to matter so much. And to that point, I think this is another place where the innovation is really important. To me, I think people's tastes over food are going to be pretty stable over time. And the idea that people are going to change their consumption baskets away from the high emissions food, to me seems really far-fetched. I grew up in like really the meat and potatoes of the US in Chicago. Their potatoes year 2500, and we're going to be kind of ripping it out of the, I would say cold dead hands. It's going to be hot by then in Chicago. And so, but we have now all this innovation in these alternative meat technologies like this. There's the cell-based meat, there's the Beyond and Impossible brands, there's all of these new companies that are popping up, hundreds of millions of dollars of venture capital. So I think if we can make these alternative technologies cheaper and tastier, then people wouldn't have to change their tastes, and maybe we would see some substantial reduction in emissions. I don't know exactly what percentage of global emissions it is that's kind of in animal agriculture, but as you said, agriculture itself is a quarter of global emissions, and I think a lot of that is in, meat and dairy and egg production. And so I think of that as like a really critical area for innovation on the mitigation side of climate change. And that gets to kind of more broadly, how are we using our land? This interacts with the more inefficiently we get our calories, the more we have to cut down rainforests in Brazil and things like that in order to grow more food. We have these ethanol policies. There's a lot of other things going on here. But I think the conversations we have about food and emissions are it doesn't really matter if you buy from your local farmer's market. And that's kind of what people are mostly talking about.
And I think, and just in general, thank you so much for that, because the other dimension of food security in the context of climate change and sustainability is that, of course, nothing is more correlated with political unrest and instability than food inflation. And now in the context of Russia's invasion, of course, we're seeing a spike in that. But what I think, and again, for the audience to think about the relationship and the interface to government, governments are going to be under threat, to not just from the factors that I mentioned at the outset, but also from the risk of political instability from below, especially in the context of food, which is just empirically known to be correlated with that, which I think brings me, Ishaan, to this maybe final question before we open it up to others, although I have one other one in my pocket before we do that. But let's just spend some time on the colossal challenge of the disparity of impact and cost between the wealthiest countries and the poorest. I'm a professional scenario planner, as you know. That's what I do for a living. And when we look at what is going to shape the 20-year future, the 10-year future, inequality has an outsized impact across countless variables, including with respect to climate change. So how do you see, what does the data tell you about how those impacts are unfolding differently?
Yeah, certainly. I think this is a huge question. I just want to say one thing on the previous topic also about the self-sufficiency versus kind of global integration as a mechanism for reducing these sorts of shocks of food inflation. I think when we think about what's salient to people about being globally interconnected, it's that you are more vulnerable to faraway shocks the more globally interconnected you are. But on the other hand, the proportion of your vulnerability is going to be much smaller if you're sort of globally diversified. So we think about anything, any kind of any random variable that you have in statistics, the bigger sample size over which you average, the smaller the volatility is going to be. So I think that's how you think about global integration. If I'm averaging over just my own country, I'm going to get more volatility in what sorts of random shocks we have, weather shocks, geopolitical shocks, whatever, than if I'm averaging over a broad swath of the whole world. So you'll be vulnerable to these further shocks, but they'll be a smaller part of your vulnerability is kind of how I think about that.
100%. So by the way, we just that point, we're just seeing it in spades from our clients. So having both the arrangements, the diversified portfolio of suppliers, but also, as you said earlier, the supporting trade infrastructure, including cold chain, to make that possible, to make it possible to have well-diversified portfolios is huge. And I mean, and again, that's where there's also a gap between rich and poor countries is in infrastructure, but I know that's just one part of it. Please.
Yeah, no, excellent. That's a great point. Sorry, my heating has come on, so I'm going to try to talk over it. But basically, in the economics research on the impacts of weather and climate on the economy, just in study after study on sector after sector, we see that the richer countries are just so much more able to deal, so much more resilient, so much more able to deal with these sorts of shocks. So I think economic growth is like a really underrated tool to adapt to climate change without doing any climate specific thing. Just if we're growing and countries and people are getting richer, in India, 2% of the population has air conditioning installed in their homes. It's like 115, 120 degrees Fahrenheit in Delhi in the summer, and 2% of people have air conditioning. So we think about getting richer, there's sorts of technologies that already exist that as they diffuse across the world will really make people more resilient to the sorts of climate change that we expect to see. But I think a couple challenges that we have to think about regarding related to this are first of all, are we innovating in ways that are relevant to poor countries where the worst impacts of climate change are happening? There's a really great paper, a new paper by two of my colleagues in economics, Jacob Moscona and Karthik Sastry, that basically shows that, that in agriculture, a really big reason technology doesn't diffuse across the world is because the innovations are so place specific. So you have certain soils and certain geography and certain hydrology and certain pests and certain challenges in rich countries. Those might be different than those that you face in poor countries. So you have a new seed variety that works really well in a rich country. What they show is that the poor countries that happen to have similar soil and like local pest characteristics, those disproportionately get the benefits of these rich country innovations. Because to a first order approximation, only the rich countries innovate. Like 99% of the world's R&D is in the OECD or in the richest 15 countries of the world. So you get these innovations in rich countries, and only sometimes are they relevant to the innovations that are actually helpful to poor countries. So that's one big challenge. And related to that, I guess another really salient example to me is the COVID vaccine versus our lack of progress in a malaria vaccine over the last several decades. I forget the exact stat, but it's something like all of the R&D into a malaria vaccine in human history was less than we invested in the COVID vaccine in like the first 6 months of having COVID. So imagine if we had put that sort of effort towards these sort of neglected tropical diseases that affect billions of people around the world, maybe then we'd be getting innovations that mattered more for poor countries. So that's challenge one is, are the innovations even usable in poor countries? Are they attacking the right challenges for these broad swaths of the population of the world that have so little income and so little ability to pay for the outcomes of these innovations? And then the second one is, of course, are these innovations flowing to the extent that they are useful? Are they flowing from the richer countries to the poorer countries? And I think we don't really have a great understanding of exactly what drives that process of ideas and innovations diffusing across the world. It's kind of an active area of research in economics. We know it's super, super important. And we imagine that some mechanisms like trade or migration might be really important for diffusing these innovations around the world. But I don't think we have great empirical evidence on exactly how that happens. We just know it's important.
Fantastic. One last thing, if I may, it relates to your last point before we go over to questions. And I know I've got some in the chat. I'm going to go there in just a moment. and we'll turn over to questions in just a couple minutes. But among these variables, what do you think is a policy response that's really been neglected in the context of climate change that we really need to include in our calculus?
Yeah, so people ask me this all the time, and I think my answer is something different than a lot of people are used to hearing. My answer is it would be really great if we let people move from the parts of the world that are hardest hit by global warming to the parts of the world that are less hard hit. And so when we're talking about these extreme disparities and the impacts we can expect between poor and rich countries, unfortunately, the world as it exists right now, people are pretty much locked into where they're born. I was born in India. My family moved to Chicago when I was 2 years old, but that's like really unusual in a global context. When you look at the data, people who are born in poor countries, to the extent that they ever leave their countries, which is already pretty rare to begin with, they mostly move to other poorer countries. So there's almost no migration from poor to rich countries. You hear kind of in the popular press these imagined ideas of all of these climate refugees we'll have in the future and what sort of instability is that going to cause in richer countries. And I think there's certainly research suggesting that these impacts are likely to cause greater demand for refugees and global migration. But I think it's worth noting right now that we don't come anywhere close to meeting that demand. There are 84 million people living in refugee camps right now. And last year, the United States allowed 10,000 refugees in. So that's 4 orders of magnitude. That's 10,000 times 10 times 10 times 10. And then you get to the number of refugees we have in the world. So to a first order approximation, when situations occur that create these sorts of global migration shocks, people just live their lives in these like really terrible circumstances in refugee camps. And so I think we already are not utilizing this kind of tool to alleviate global poverty and to kind of improve the global economy in our current world. And as climate change hits different parts of the world so differently over the coming decades, that's just going to become more and more important. And so hopefully it doesn't remain so neglected.
And I must say, thank you for saying that, because our scenario analysis reveals also that if you don't make those adaptations now, if you don't facilitate it so that it can happen intentionally over time, you're going to get the migration anyway, because we're going to see mass, uncontrolled, and highly destabilizing migration. We're even seeing, of course, forced migration being used as a weapon, but that's a whole other topic. Okay, Ishaan, I thank you so much. Let me turn to the questions. And let's see here. Sorry, in WhatsApp. Great, hang on. Forgive me, I was in the wrong channel. Here we go. Okay, questions coming through. How can central government support local government in achieving or moving towards net zero? By the way, Ishaan, you probably get this a lot, but you're going to be considered the all-knowing one who can answer any questions. So do the best you can. But how can central governments better support local governments in moving towards net zero?
I'm not sure I have anything brilliant or insightful to say about that. I guess it's local governments. This is just kind of something that pops into my head, is that local governments frequently don't have resources. They frequently have institutional capacity, but their ability to raise taxes or to just kind of fund themselves is much more limited. Their mechanisms are much more limited. You also have kind of a lot more migration between states than between countries. And so when local governments raise taxes, you might worry that people will just move a little bit over or something like that. And so I guess resources are probably resources and other sorts of institutional capacity that central governments have. They can lend to local governments.
Absolutely.
I don't know. Do you have more thoughts?
No, I do. I mean, we do. It's funny because I want to direct these questions to you. We do a lot of work in this space too. Everything you've said is true. And it's also true. It's actually implicit in your prior comments that large entities, the European Union has an advantage in being able to diffuse innovation out to local governments rapidly and efficiently. The US has that advantage. China has that advantage. It's small, poorer countries that are at a great disadvantage, and that's exacerbated by the trade obstacles that you discussed. So great. Now, second question. It is quite clear why agricultural sector is vulnerable to climate change. How would climate change impact or affect the manufacturing sector, and what would be the implications on national competitiveness?
Yeah, so I actually did a lot of work on this in my dissertation. In that paper that I was describing, I kind of skipped this section, but I also gathered data from like half the world's global population on plant level manufacturing output and studied the impacts of extreme temperatures on manufacturing. And it's kind of fascinating what I found there, or it was fascinating to me, of course, since I spent 5 years of my life trying to teach myself how to do a PhD. What I found there was that in poor countries, manufacturing can be extremely vulnerable to extreme temperatures that we might expect climate change to be causing, and especially so in places where firms aren't particularly used to extreme temperatures. So an unexpected hot or cold day for a kind of unproductive firm that's like those that we would see in a poorer country, one really hot or really cold day reduces annual output per worker in manufacturing by about zero point 0.4 percentage points, which if you think about a 50-week, 5-day work week, 50-week year with 5 days per work week, that's about 0.4 percentage points is about the equivalent of one full working day. So basically what you see in the data is that for the kind of least adapted, least protected firms, one hot day basically zeroes out output with no compensating substitution to other days. So manufacturing can be quite vulnerable to these sorts of extremes in certain contexts, but it also seems like we basically have the technology to eliminate that vulnerability at a relatively low cost. So in places like the United States, I see like a very precise zero of the impacts of extreme temperatures on manufacturing. You can run any different kind of regression specification that you want. There just really doesn't seem to be an impact in the United States. And that's because it seems like the other thing you see in the US data is that manufacturing plants for every really hot or cold day are spending like $4,000 or $5,000 extra on annual energy expenditures, presumably because they have the heating and cooling to protect their workers and equipment. So they don't have output losses. They pay a bit of adaptation costs to protect themselves from these extreme temperatures. But in the context of their scale, it turns out that these adaptation costs are not really that big. And so I wouldn't expect in the richer countries, the manufacturing sector to be terribly vulnerable, with the possible exception of like coastal impacts from hurricanes and flooding and those sorts of things that you might expect to see in some places. But from temperature, which is kind of the most predictable consequence of climate change, I wouldn't expect big effects in rich countries, but you'd expect some substantial effects in poorer countries.
Absolutely. I mean, it just adds another pillar to your argument about, and for all of us to remember, both from a moral standpoint, but also from an opportunity standpoint about this differential impact of poor countries, because it just keeps getting reinforced by factor after factor. And I mean, a question I'm longing to ask you, and maybe we can return to it after I get through these, but just to place the seed in your mind is, how can we harness incentives to drive greater innovation in these poor countries? What can be done? I think that's one of the questions that most fascinates me. But before you go there, let's take care of the audience. So the next question is, what kinds of partnerships are required for the public sector to accelerate their efforts? What are the new kind of partnerships that they need? In my opening presentation, I mentioned a few. What else have you seen that might work?
I'm not really sure this is an area in which I have much knowledge about public sector partnerships. Uh, I guess it's always valuable for the public sector to sort of think about who the most vulnerable people are that are affected by these sorts of impacts. And so you can imagine partnerships with sort of private sector and kind of the in-between NGO sector, where they're really trying to understand, for example, I guess in New York City, there's some evidence that there's some papers that one of my friends wrote in New York City. His name is Jisung Park, about how extreme heat is really bad for student learning. Like the test scores of students in New York City really suffer when there's hotter, when they suffer more extreme temperatures. And so you might imagine partnerships between the public sector and local public and private schools on how are we going to protect our students from these extreme temperatures. Are we installing air conditioning? Are we installing some sort of mechanisms for them to make up learning when there are shocks? Weather's it turns out it's an important one, but it's small relative to something like COVID, where we have students out of school for a long time. So I think the important kind of ethos for partnerships that I would think of for the public sector are thinking about, if we understand what the impacts are and who they're affecting, then we can think about the groups that already work with those populations that are most effective, and how do we partner with them. That's kind of a pretty generic answer. I don't think I have like
No, I appreciate it very much. I mean, and I would just add, and we'll share the slide. I think it's a great answer. I think, to simplify across a whole range of cases that we've seen of the partnerships that can be most productive, almost all of them hinge, even the one you've given as an example, but almost all of them hinge on just collaborating more closely with the private sector to understand their constraints and incentives, and then to try to optimize regulatory environments. I mean, the Dutch have done this brilliantly. The EU is trying to do it better. Singapore is trying to do it. Those case studies are just a handful of, by understanding the incentives and requirements of the private sector, designing regulatory arrangements together. And it sounds like it's easy to say, but it's rarely done, and it's so powerful when you see it done. Okay, one more. As the cost of living crisis intensifies under inflation, presumably, how can we ensure that the energy and water sectors don't lose sight of net zero? Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really big problem, and I think this is why you need policies that are binding. So if you have a policy that's binding, then it sort of doesn't matter what the other shocks are that are going on. Like the EU has decreed in this cap and trade, we're going to reduce emissions by X. Whereas if you have a policy that's kind of subsidizing a certain technology, like maybe we're subsidizing carbon capture in the US in some of these new bills, maybe we're innovating in that. But if there's no incentive, we need some sort of demand side pull for these technologies to be profitable. Like if there's no penalty for carbon emissions, why would I, even if it costs $1, why would I install carbon capture on my natural gas plant if the cost is $1 and the benefit to me is zero? And so I think when we face these sorts of cost of living crises, or this really severe inflation that we're having, I'm going to work at the Fed soon. I don't know that much about inflation. I have to learn about it, I guess. I think this kind of highlights the basic problem we have of credibility and of policies that the best they can do to achieve credibility in some sense is unachievable because a different government could come in and undo a policy, but the best we can do is have a policy that has some sort of binding requirement to reduce emissions so that we can't suffer this situation where other shocks happen in our society that are unrelated to climate change. All of a sudden it's, we want to pump more oil because of these impacts of the war on global oil prices and things like that. Those sorts of things there's always going to be something. There's going to be a financial crisis 10 years ago. Now there's all these other, COVID, cost of living crisis, this like really terrible war that, Russia is creating in Europe. So there's always going to be, if there's always going to be something, then that just really underscores the need for policies that are as binding as possible, so that we can't get distracted by whatever current shiny crisis is distracting us from this future slowly unfolding global crisis.
100%. Thank you so much. Well, everyone, listen, please join me in giving a virtual round of applause to Dr. Ishaan. Ishaan, it was a pleasure speaking with you. Thanks for the work you're doing. Good luck at the Fed in California. You'll be back in our old stomping grounds. It's been a pleasure to speak with you. Thanks to the audience for those great questions. I wish we had more time, but alas, I think our time is up. I'm going to pass it back to the moderator. Thanks again, Ishaan.
Thanks so much for having me. This was super fun.